Welcome back to the listener's commentary on the New Testament. The listener's commentary is made possible because of the generosity of followers of Jesus all around the world who believe in this ministry and because of the impact it's had on their life. And one of the ways that you can support this ministry, besides just clicking the give button at listenerscommentary.com, is you can sign up for the Study Hub. The Study Hub currently includes a handful of online video-based courses like Bible survey, Bible study skills, basic theology, the basics of spiritual growth. It's got a short little mini course on how to read the Bible and pray regularly for the sake of growing your relationship with God. So it has those courses. And plus, slowly but surely, I am adding supplemental material to the audio recordings for the commentary with pictures and maps and charts and graphs and links to other articles and things like that. And so that is a great way also to support this ministry, as well as receive some benefit to yourself for increased study and learning as you go. So if you want to support the ministry that way, just go to listenerscommentary.com, click sign up in the Study Hub box. It'll take you to a page where you can choose an amount you want to give to the ministry as well as for the Study Hub. And then from there, it'll redirect you through the pages to set up that Study Hub account. So thanks to all of you who make this ministry possible by your generous support. In this recording, we're going to be looking at John chapter 5, verses 1 through 16. In the flow of John's gospel, he has now recorded the first two signs, or the first two sign miracles, if you will, of Jesus, both of which happened in Galilee, and specifically in the little village of Cana in Galilee, a village that's not mentioned in any of the other gospels. In this snapshot here in John chapter 5, 1 through 16, John is going to recount a third sign for us, this time not in Galilee, but in Jerusalem. And one of the key things we'll see is it happens on the Sabbath. All four of the Gospels record Jesus performing miracles on the Sabbath, and in doing so, stirring up the ire of the religious authorities. The fact is, Jesus could have avoided conflict by waiting a handful of hours until the Sabbath was over, but he didn't, which does suggest to me that Jesus knew exactly what he was doing, that he was in some ways directly challenging some of the traditions that had grown up around Sabbath observances. And that's often the way traditions go. They can start out good, but then they kind of grow and elaborate and get more rigid and hardened. And that had happened with some of the Jewish traditions around the Sabbath. And Jesus heals on the Sabbath, it seems, to directly engage that. This miracle that we'll see here in this snapshot flows into a long discourse that focuses on Jesus' equality with God the Father and Jesus' authority to give life, including authority over the resurrection from the dead. And so we have in chapter 5 a recount of a miracle, 1 through 16, what we'll look at in this recording, and then a long discourse about who Jesus is and the kind of authority he has. So let's pick up in John chapter 5, verse 1, and it reads like this. After these things, a general transition saying, meanwhile, sometime later, right, time has passed, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. As we've noted many times, John, in kind of supplementing what the other Gospels say, focuses his story of Jesus on Jerusalem and Judea and the area around Jerusalem. And so he spends more time there than he does on what Jesus did in Galilee. In this case, there's an unspecified feast of the Jews that brings Jesus to Jerusalem. Since John doesn't tell us which feast this is, we don't really know. We're left to guess. And there's been a handful of suggestions, but it doesn't really matter because to John it wasn't important which feast it was, only that it led Jesus to be in Jerusalem. And so Jesus goes to Jerusalem for this unspecified feast, and verse 2 reads, Now in Jerusalem, by the sheep gate, there is a pool which in Hebrew is called Bethesda, having 5 porticoes, or if you will, 5 porches. We actually know where this pool is at, and you can see a picture of it. I'll actually put a picture of it in the study hub. And there's both ruins that we can look at today as well as replicas that we get a sense of what it looked like. And the reason it had 5 covered porches is because it was 2 pools side by side with a porch that went down the middle. So you have 5 covered porches down the sides and through the middle. And apparently, this particular pool had become a local gathering place for invalids because there was some superstition about the healing properties of the water. So here's the way the story unfolds. Verse 3. In these porticoes, in these porches, lay multitude of those who were sick, blind, limping, or paralyzed. Now, depending on what version you have, you may also have a second half of verse 3 and a verse 4 that's in brackets or perhaps in a footnote. And the reason for that is because it's a verse that explains the superstition around these pools and why all these sick people and blind and limping and paralyzed people were there. And that tradition went like this, that these waters on occasion would begin to kind of bubble and move. And when they were stirred up, there was this superstition that somehow that brought healing properties into the water, that maybe that meant the angel or something was stirring it up. And now those waters for that moment had some sort of healing power. And the reason those words are in brackets or in a footnote is because they're not in the earliest and best manuscripts of the New Testament. And so we don't know that they're original. In fact, more than likely, they probably were written by somebody in the margin to explain the superstition lying behind the story, just so that we would know what was going on. And then at some point, some copyist accidentally put them into the body rather than into the margin when they were hand copying them, and that's how they ended up in there. Either way, what they do is they serve to explain why all these invalids and sick people were here at these pools. So Jesus in Jerusalem wanders into, intentionally perhaps, or maybe just walking through Jerusalem, walks by these pools, notices all the sick people, and he singles out one man whose situation is particularly desperate. Look at verse 5. Now there was a man there along the pools, in the porches, lying there. There was a man there who had been ill for 38 years. That's a long time, and his situation seems very desperate. You can hear it in the words that he's going to speak here very shortly. Jesus, upon seeing this man lying there, and knowing that he'd already been there in that condition for a long time, said to him, "Do you want to get well?" It's obvious to Jesus that this man is older. It's obvious that he has suffered for a very long time. He could just tell by looking at him that was the case. And Jesus approaches this man and asks him if he wants to get well. And the man responds not by really saying yes or no per se, but by explaining why he hasn't been able to and what he's been trying to do. Look at verse 7. The sick man answered him, that is Jesus, and said, "Sir, I have nobody to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up. But while I'm coming, another person steps down before me." So you sort of have to picture the scene. Jesus asks this man if he wants to get well, and the man explains his problem based on what happens when the waters are stirred up because of that superstition. So there's this belief that the waters are stirred up and have healing properties. This man is lying there along with plenty of other sick and desperate people. And so then the waters begin to move. And so he begins to drag himself somehow towards the pool. We don't know exactly what his condition was, but he begins to drag himself towards the pool. But others push by him, get past him, and by the time he finally gets there down into the water, it's too late. The waters are still. He can't get better. And what you hear, I think, in his words here in verse 7 is a sense of desperation and helplessness. I've tried. I'm banking on this pool. It's not working. I can't get there fast enough. And even though it's based on a superstition, even though it's somewhat of a foolhardy approach based on that superstition, Jesus still responds and responds to him with compassion. Look at verse 8 and 9. Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your pallet and walk." And immediately the man became well. He picked up his pallet and he began to walk. And so it appears this man, when it says he was ill, had some sort of disease that made him unable to walk. And so he was laying there on his pallet. What's a pallet? Well, it's some sort of woven mat, woven maybe out of palm branches or something like that. He's got a mat that he has been lying on, and Jesus tells him to get up, pick up his mat, and walk. And immediately the man does that. He becomes completely healed, and he carries his pallet, and he walks away from the pool of Bethesda. And before we continue on with the story, I just want to highlight that Jesus does this for him without ever asking if he believes, without ever asking him to believe. He only asked him if he wanted to get well, and the man responds with his helplessness based on a superstition. And even then, Jesus simply speaks a word, and the man is completely healed. Now, there's one problem with this healing, and John highlights it for us in the next phrase. Notice what he says. Now it was a Sabbath on that day. Not only has Jesus healed this man on the Sabbath, I mean, if you really want to honor God, Jesus, come on, just wait a few hours till the Sabbath is over, and then you can heal somebody. So Jesus heals on the Sabbath, but not only that, Jesus told this man to pick up his mat and carry it on the Sabbath. And Jesus knows the rules of Sabbath observance. He knows what the traditions are, and so it seems to me that he's deliberately kind of subverting them, challenging their traditions, not only by healing on the Sabbath, but by commanding this man to carry his mat on the Sabbath. I mean, carrying anything on the Sabbath was prohibited, not by the Torah, but by tradition. And that becomes the focus then of what follows. Not Jesus' power, not who Jesus is, but the initial response is, it's the Sabbath, guys. So look at verse 10. So the Jews were saying to the man who was cured, it's the Sabbath. It's not permissible for you to carry your pallet, not permissible for you to carry your mat. That's their concern. They see this man walking through the streets of Jerusalem, carrying his mat, and their concern is, what are you doing? You're breaking the Sabbath. And he answered them in verse 11 and said, he who made me well was the one who said to me, pick up your pallet and walk. In other words, the man is explaining what happened. He's carrying his mat because it's one of the few possessions he has, and he was told by Jesus to pick it up and leave the pool of Bethesda. So he's simply doing what he was told by someone with the authority and the power to heal. Well, they responded by asking him, who's the man who said to you, pick it up and walk? Notice that. They don't ask, who's the man who healed you of your disease? They want to know, who's the one who told you to violate Sabbath tradition? But the man who was healed didn't know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away while there was a crowd in that place. So when Jesus heals this man, there's tons of people around. There's all the other sick people. There's a crowd with Jesus. It's very crowded. It's a feast, so Jerusalem has extra people in it. Lots of people in the area. He heals the man, and the man gets up, and in his excitement, grabbing his pallet, Jesus leaves. And he and Jesus were never properly introduced. So he didn't know who this man was because Jesus had slipped away. Well, after all of this, Jesus, sometime later that day, found the man in the temple. So the man has carried his pallet into the temple. Maybe he set it down somewhere because he didn't want any more trouble. Who knows? But Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, behold, you have become well. You're healed. Then Jesus said, don't sin anymore so that nothing worse happens to you. Recall that they're in Jerusalem for a feast, and the temple is not very far from these pools. And so it's not a long walk into the temple. And the temple is going to be the center of activity for Jewish feasts and Jewish worship. And so Jesus goes into the temple, finds this man in the temple, properly introduces himself there in the temple, and tells the man, don't sin anymore so that nothing worse may befall you. Now, Jesus' words to this man suggest that perhaps in his case, there was some connection between sinning and his prior condition. mean, practically speaking, we know this is true. For example, I knew somebody who had struggled with alcoholism for years and years and years. And he died at a young age from both liver disease. And while he was alive, he had struggled with all sorts of painful gout, most of which was exacerbated by his alcoholism, right? Or some sin leads to accidents and injury, and now you struggle for the rest of your life. And so that may be what Jesus is getting at, that in this man's case, there was some sort of sinning that led to his condition. We're not sure. Now, if that's the case, I think it only heightens the mercy and the grace in Jesus in reaching out to this man and healing this man. I mean, he didn't have to. The man never confessed faith in Jesus. If his condition is directly connected to some sin that he had done 38 years prior, then that would only heighten Jesus' grace. But if that's the case, don't turn it into a general principle that every person who has some malady, like paralysis, must have sinned, and that's why they're in that condition. In fact, the disciples make that kind of assumption in John chapter 9, and Jesus rejects the idea. And so I think it's more of a case-by-case sort of basis. And so in this man's case, Jesus suggests perhaps that was the case. At least Jesus' words make very plain that there is a connection between negative consequences to our life and sinning. And I think that's what we should focus on with these words here. We know that sin has consequences, both in this life and in the life to come. And so we should hear Jesus' words as a compassionate warning for this man and really for all of us. Quit sinning so that nothing worse may befall you. Well, the man's response is very interesting. Look at verse 15. After meeting Jesus in the temple and now figuring out who it was that actually healed him, the man, verse 15, went away and informed the Jews that it was Jesus who had made him well. We're not told his motivation behind that. We're not told what he was thinking and his rationale behind that, but they had wondered who it was that had told him to pick up his mat. So he decides to go and tell them, hey, I just saw him again. It was Jesus. And John then summarizes the ending of this account this way for us in verse 16. For this reason, based on this, based on the fact that this man reported it was Jesus, based on the fact that Jesus healed on the Sabbath, told this man to carry his pallet on the Sabbath, for this reason, the Jews, that is, the Jewish leaders there in Jerusalem, were persecuting Jesus because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. They don't discount the miracle. They don't, at least in this moment, challenge that Jesus has some sort of power. What they're upset about is that he's violating their traditions. Traditions they believe help them keep the Torah better, but they're not traditions that are written in the Torah. They are simply rabbinic traditions, and Jesus is violating them, and that angers them, and so now their hostility towards Jesus is ramped up. And then this leads in the Gospel of John to a long discourse by Jesus about why he has the authority to do what he does, even on the Sabbath, who he is, and what that means. And so the real point John wants to drive home from this story shows up in the reflections and the discourse that follows.